Okay, welcome everyone. Um, this program is offered through the Davenport Public Library and the Special Collections, the Richardson Sloan Special Collection Center of the Davenport Public Library. My name is Catherine Kuntz, and I am very pleased to welcome Leo Landis, the State Curator at the State Historical Society of Iowa. He's going to be speaking about their exhibit and what great work they've done celebrating the 175 years of Iowa history. So I will hand it over to him.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thank you to all of you, but thank you especially to Davenport Public Library for inviting me to do this presentation. Really pleased to be working with folks in Scott County on this and in the great city of Davenport. So let's jump right in. The exhibit Iowa's People and Places is connected, as we said, to Iowa statehood and the 175th anniversary of Iowa statehood to commemorate that. And it really does try to cover over 13,000 years of Iowa history. It's divided chronologically, and we don't always do that with our exhibits, but in this one we did. And the exhibit opens up with a primary panel, and we're open, so I don't forget to say this, we are currently open Tuesdays through Fridays, 9 to 4:30. So you can see it, and I'll also share as we wrap up how you can look at the whole exhibit virtually. You can't read every label, but you can read almost everything on the main label. So taking you from the first peoples of Iowa up to 2020 as we talk about Iowa history. So not just the 175 years of Iowa statehood that we'll be commemorating later this month, but 13,000 years of Iowa history and Iowa's people and places. The exhibit, as I said, is arranged chronologically, beginning with First Peoples, the native peoples who still are in our state and have long been in our state. And then the next section, which begins with the Louisiana Purchase, talks about how what we consider Iowa today became part of the United States, and then takes you through the Civil War era. Then after that, we chose statewide settlement as a term to describe the next section, and that really looks at how especially Northwest Iowa develops, but the entire state finally is able to be open for settlement and community building. And so that's what we look at in that period, and ending a little bit with the progressive era or populist era of 1896. Populist era ends and the progressive era begins. And so then a new century taking you up to 1963. That, of course, includes 2 world wars and a Great Depression, so a lot to cover there. But I often say in this talk that if we can do the first peoples of what becomes Iowa, close to 13,000 or 12,000 years of history in that section, we can do 2 world wars and a Great Depression in a section too. And then taking the 1960s up to 1986 as a period, we used 1986 as a bit of the end of the farm crisis in Iowa, knowing that people were still struggling in many of Iowa's rural communities, but land prices start to bounce back in 1986. So things were starting to stabilize by then. And then taking the more current era up to 1987 to the present. So that's the general overview of the exhibit. The main panel, when you come in, shows a image of a poster done by Mildred Pelzer, an Iowa City artist. And as she was looking at Iowa approaching the territorial centennial of 1938, her husband was a history professor at University of Iowa. She thought somebody should do a pictorial map of Iowa history, and then she decided to do it. It's a neat concept of what she thought was important in Iowa history. She consulted a lot of people, including Benjamin Shambaugh, who was head of the Historical Society in Iowa City at the time, and other consulting historians. And because she was a woman, it's actually really good on women's history and figures, female figures in Iowa history. I don't have a zoom in on this image, but the Mason City area, so up in north central Iowa. People often associate Mason City with Meredith Willson, the composer and the playwright who does The Music Man. Well, in 1934, when Mildred Pelzer finishes this map, he's still just a musician in New York City for the most part, but his older sister Dixie was a nationally known author. And so when you look at the map and you look in Mason City, it mentions Dixie Willson, no mention at all of Meredith Willson, who today we think of Meredith Willson and have forgotten Dixie. So that was one of my discoveries in looking at that map. And then of course we show an image of the old Capitol. That's was still the state capitol when that daguerreotype was taken. It's the 1854 image that if you pay attention to Iowa history, you've probably seen before. It was the Johnson County Fair of 1854. So a really great image of people coming together to celebrate their community in what was then our state capitol in 1854. That first section is really one that we thought was critical to make sure we emphasize that our state has had people living in it since about 13,000 years ago. And wanted to emphasize not just the Meskwaki people who are still in our state, but also some of the other native peoples that have used Iowa as their ancestral home or had passed through Iowa. So I'll talk about each panel a little bit, some of the images in most cases, and then I'll talk about a highlight artifact on the right. That's what I'll try to be, or on the left, excuse me, as I move through each slide. The primary image on that panel, those are three HoChunk or Winnebago women. The HoChunk people are a Great Lakes tribe who were historically in Wisconsin, and their major population is still in Wisconsin. But as part of the Black Hawk Purchase in early Iowa territory, a HoChunk were moved into Iowa in a section in northeast Iowa. One of the early forts, and as many of you may know, some of the forts were put in place to help keep stable relationships between native nations. So the Dakota Sioux and the HoChunk had historically had tension, and so there was a neutral ground in the section where Fort Atkinson was built that was done specifically to try to keep the Dakota Nation from menacing the HoChunk people who had been moved into what is today around Fayette and Clayton County and some of that part of northeast Iowa. So the HoChunk had, as a Great Lakes tribe, a historic relationship with the Meskwaki. And so that image is actually three HoChunk women visiting the Meskwaki settlement in about the year 1900. So not a northeast Iowa photo, or the HoChunk then get pushed to Nebraska. So on the river opposite Sioux City is where a lot of the HoChunk Nation lives today, besides the Wisconsin people. And down toward Ottawa, Iowa, to the south. That's why there's a casino owned by the Winnebago or the HoChunk people on Iowa land, is because they've had a historic territory in that section too in western Iowa. So called out the HoChunk Nation and honor them. And then the image that's the print, the color print in the lower center, that's Wachamane, who was an Iowa elder and was part of the negotiations of the Iowa being forced out of the territory that they had called their ancestral home and where our state gets its name. And just as a quick aside, Iowa was the way many Iowans referred to the state as well into the 1920s. We almost everybody you hear today says Iowa, but into the 1920s, you still heard Iowa as a pronunciation for our state. So nice little aside there. And then the graphic that's on the left side of the screen, when you talk about items in the collections of the State Historical Museum of Iowa, it really is one of the most important pieces we have. It's two pieces of about 11-inch by 17 inches inch paper. And so those are separated. They were joined by sealing wax. And if my cursor is going to show up on your screen too. I'm pointing at a red dot in the center, and then another red dot, and then another red dot on the far right of the lower section. So the two sections were joined by sealing wax to make one document. This is a drawing done by Waukeshashi, Meskwaki elder, and it was a gift, as best we know, to George Davenport, so the namesake of your community, or one of your communities if you're from Bettendorf, or one of the other Quad Cities or somewhere else in Scott County. But because George Davenport had had that historic relationship that was based on trade and developed friendships with the Meskwaki, Waukeshashi drew figures that were important to the Meskwaki Nation, the animals. So in that upper panel in the center, you'll see a lot of fishes. There's a catfish, perhaps some sturgeon, a paddlefish in the upper center. But there's also scenes from his life. And so there's a bison hunt in that upper left segment of the upper portion. And so they're hunting a bison. And also in that kind of center section there is a battle scene where Waukeshashi is the figure behind a tree and he is shooting an enemy. And so he drew a couple of battle scenes. That's also depicted a separate battle scene on the lower section where he is killing an enemy. And so he was drawing scenes that were important to him, but also that were important to all the Meskwaki people. And in that lower section, he's actually drawing power from the living creatures. So there are power lines going from him. I will send Catherine a couple of links to some articles on this drawing that have been done. Jack Musgrove and his wife Mary. Jack was the longtime curator of the State Historical Museum from the 1960s into his death in 1980. And then Gaylord Torrance, who was a professor at Drake University and then went on to be curator of Native American Plains Indian and Prairie Indian art at the Nelson Atkins Gallery. They've both done some great stories on this piece, but really represents the way that American Indians and the Meskwaki in particular viewed a relationship with animals. And so a really powerful piece. It's currently on display in the museum. We'll probably keep it on display through the end of March 2022, but if you want to see the original, we'll take it off, being a pen and ink drawing, because that's what it is. It's ink done as a freehand drawing by Waukeshashi. It is light sensitive, so we'll be taking it off display. So that's a great Scott County related artifact, and one that we're just honored to have in the collections of the State Historical Museum. And I may talk about that longer than I talk about any other artifact. So Nick's section, as I said, is that section called Becoming Americans, looking at the Louisiana Purchase to the Civil War era in Iowa. We used 1868 as the end of the Civil War era in Iowa because there are two monumental cases that are too important. There are more than just two, but really two transformative pieces in Iowa history in 1868 connected to the Civil War. And so the main image is the territorial capitol building that was the first territorial capitol in Iowa City before the old capitol was built. That's obviously a later picture from the 1860s, 1870s, but that's where we had our first territorial capitol, just in a frame building in Iowa City. And then the artifact that chose to talk about tonight is, again, that was one of our ideas with this exhibit, is to show some really important artifacts in Iowa history. And this is a Civil War battle flag. It's about 70 inches by 80 inches. And knowing that your screens might be a little smaller than mine, but where the eagle is in the blue field, that's the canton of the flag. And then in that red ribbon section that's below the eagle, the lettering is hand painted, as are the stars and the eagle and the red ribbon. And the lettering in that section says, First Colored Regiment of Iowa. And so this is the flag carried by the 1 regiment of black men serving on behalf of our state in the Civil War. You know, you think about the American Civil War, it's where one group of states wanted to preserve the right to enslave other people, a racist ideal. And here was a group of black men, not all from Iowa, but serving on behalf of Iowa. It's about 1,000 men in a regiment who were willing, even though they didn't have the right to vote in Iowa, weren't serving on juries. There had been laws in effect in our state to try to even prevent blacks from coming to Iowa, and yet they were willing to fight on behalf of the nation and state. The flag itself was made by black women of Keokuk and Muscatine for the regiment. Most regiments had two flags, a national flag and a regimental flag. This is a little bit of a blend, so not completely sure whether it's their national flag because it does have all the stars of the states on it, but regimental flags typically also had that eagle that you see there. But what a flag conservator who has looked at this flag for us. So where you see the lighter sections on the flag in the stripe area, that's where the flag, because it was hanging on display in the state capitol, is gone. So there's a lot of damage in the larger section of the flag, but a flag conservator who looked at this for us has said that no, those really were the 13 stripes on the flag that had been dyed red in some cases, and then the white stripes. And so it really did represent the national flag as well. It's just light damage over time had caused that red to fade, but just a really important piece. And I mentioned two court cases, or at least a court case and another event that happened in 1867 and 1868 that are important in Iowa history. The 1867 court case that then is settled by the Iowa Supreme Court in April of 1868 is Clark versus Muscatine Board of Directors. And that's where Alexander Clark, a black man in Muscatine, and again, maybe a story that some or all of you know, but really think it's important to share. Black man from Muscatine has a 12-year-old daughter who wants to go to the public school in Muscatine. Muscatine had segregated schools, as did Des Moines, and I know Keokuk did, and I haven't determined if Davenport did have segregated schools pre-Civil War or not. It wouldn't surprise me if that was the case, Davenport having a somewhat larger black population even pre-Civil War than other Iowa communities. So we know Keokuk, Des Moines, I should say Dubuque too. I know Dubuque had segregated schools. But Clark says that's not right, files a lawsuit. The Muscatine Board of Directors lose the suit, and Muscatine is told it has to integrate its schools. They appeal to the Iowa Supreme Court, and in April of 1868, Justice Cole, writing on behalf of the majority, says, no, you cannot have legalized segregated schools in Iowa. So 1868 says you have to have educational equality for students in Iowa. One of those ideas of equality that we think is foundational to our nation and our state says that has to be the case 86 years before Brown versus Board of Education. So we did have segregated schools, but it became illegal in 1868. Dubuque was the last town I know that tried to segregate schools, and they were still trying into the 1870s. 1876, I think, was the 1874 was about the time where Dubuque realized, and a black man in Dubuque whose daughter was going to what was the colored school files a suit against Dubuque, and Dubuque finally says, okay. I think the year was 1874. Dubuque gives up on trying to segregate its schools. So the other important case, or the issue that comes up in 1868, is black men get the right to vote in Iowa. We strike the word white from our Constitution in 1868. I say we, the white men of Iowa age 21 or older. I always try to remind people that when you say voters in Iowa, if it's pre-1868, it's only white men age 21 or over, and if it's pre-1920, it's only men. So I try to stay away from using the word voter when I'm talking in the past and be explicit on who the people making those choices were. So in 1868, the white men of Iowa voted to strike the word white from our Constitution. And so that was another step for equality in our state. The next section, statewide settlement. The scene on the right is a community in western Iowa. We think it's Harrison County. We're almost sure. My label says Missouri Valley, but I know from talking to Representative Winchittle, who's from Missouri Valley, and looking after he challenged me on it, Missouri Valley, the town, is not really on the Missouri River, so the river's in the background of that photo. So we're pretty sure it's still Harrison County, but it's not going to be Missouri Valley. So that's one of those things where if you come and see the exhibit, full disclosure, I now know from more research that my caption on that photo is not quite right. But the Civil War really did stop settlement toward northwest Iowa. So even in 1870, when you look at the population census for O'Brien or Sioux or Lyon or Osceola counties, there are less than 150 people in each of those counties in the year 1870. So you think, Dubuque and Davenport have tens of thousands of people in them just as a city. You've got counties that have under less than 200 people in northwest Iowa. So that war disrupts our state, but then things really take off as railroad development happens and you have land opening up. More people are coming to northwest Iowa. So thought that was a good caption for this section of the exhibit. And the little sofa or settee or love seat, whatever you want to call the piece of furniture there that's the larger artifact in that display case. That's from talking with Catherine before. She'll appreciate that, knowing she has some Norwegian heritage. The couple, they were both Norwegian immigrants. They didn't come over together. They were in eastern Iowa, up around Clayton and Fayette County. And I know that because the woman, I think her last name was Svensson, because her father was Sven. So when she gets put into the census in 1870, her name is Sarah Svensson. And she worked for the Larrabee family. And William Larrabee would go on to become governor, but she was a domestic servant for the Larrabees. And then Samuel Groth was also an immigrant from Norway in the 1860s and living in northeast Iowa. Well, after the war, they were married. He didn't serve. He was a little too young, I believe, to be in service in the Civil War. But they moved to Sioux County eventually and start their own farm. So that's a little love seat used by a Norwegian, or settee used by a Norwegian couple who had a good-sized farm family in northwest Iowa in Sioux County, Sarah and Samuel Groth. So a great artifact representing that community building that's happening all across our state after the Civil War. And again, Sioux County is one county. See, yeah, it's one county down from Minnesota, and it's right on the Big Sioux River as the border on its western border. So that's where Sioux County is if you aren't up on Iowa geography quite as well. So one down from Minnesota on the western border. The next section, A New Century, the image we highlight on that panel is two families, actually, the Riveras and the Ayalas, whose ancestry comes from Mexico, but they were all born in the United States in this case. And so Aurora Rivera is the woman on the left there, and then Isabel Rivera Ayala, who marries John Ayala, the man standing with his arm around her. So two sisters, Aurora and Isabel Rivera, and in this case it's Isabel Rivera Ayala, and knowing that Scott County has a long history of Latino population, wanted to make sure we told stories of Latino Iowans. And this photo is probably it's probably Kossuth County. We don't think of this so much in Iowa agriculture today, but along that northern and north central border of Iowa and Minnesota, there was a decent amount of sugar beet production. Mason City actually had a sugar factory that made sugar from sugar beets, and that's what some of the Rivera family did, was work in sugar beet production as laborers, and some of the Rivera and Ayala family also worked in railroad labor. So really great 1930s photo showing some Latino Iowans, or Iowans with Latino heritage, enjoying auto travel across our state. And then the artifacts, and I'm going to actually talk about a couple of things in this. There's NAACP petition and charter, I should say, on the far right image. That is the Des Moines NAACP's 1915 charter. And then in the center is a hand-drawn roll of honor that lists Black men who were serving in World War I and were from Iowa. It's mostly central Iowa, but there is some eastern. I'm pretty sure there's at least one or two Davenport men listed on that. And then, excuse me, the last item that I'll talk about, at least related to Black Iowa history, is there's a little brown medical bag below the silver trophy, and I'll finish with the silver trophy. But the black medical bag is from Dr. Edward Carter, who grew up in Oskaloosa. He was the first Black man to graduate from the University of Iowa Medical School. He then goes to work in the integrated community of Buxton, Iowa. And it was a coal mining community on the Monroe-Mahaska County border, mostly in Monroe County. And in the 1960s, his daughter sent us material used by her, but also by her parents. And so we have one of the medical bags that he used when he was practicing in the integrated coal mining community of Buxton. We do give a nice shout out to women's suffrage. So there's a women's suffrage banner in this section as well. And then, as I said, the silver trophy is connected to the Wallace family of Iowa. The Wallaces originally were in southeast Iowa, then also in Ames. So Henry C. Wallace, Henry Cantwell Wallace, who goes on to be Secretary of Agriculture, is a professor at Ames. He has a son, Henry A. Wallace, who goes on to be all three Secretary of Agriculture, Vice President, and Secretary of Commerce. But Henry C. Wallace, Henry A.'s father, was the publisher of Wallace's Farmer magazine, and they offered a corn trophy for the best 10 ears of corn. I think it's 10, it might be 7. We think that trophy's from about 1905, but a corn trophy that was won by a Northwest Iowa farmer up around the New Wolfonda, Iowa area. So both a central Iowa story, but also a statewide story connected to that corn trophy. The next section is our Optimism and Crisis section, taking you from the mid-1960s, where chose that year. I didn't mention this, but that's the year that liquor by the drink gets made legal in Iowa. 1963, 1964, when Governor Hughes is elected. Prior to that, you could only buy liquor at a state liquor store, and in theory, we were only supposed to drink it at home. If you wanted a mixed drink, there were key clubs and other ways to get around that rule. But if you were to go to a restaurant or a bar, you could not have a mixed drink using hard liquor. That was illegal for that establishment to sell you a mixed drink up until 1963, 1964 in Iowa. And so I'm seeing a lot of different changes too in Iowa culture, but alcohol had long been a sticking point within Iowa communities. And so that's at least when one barrier falls, for good and for ill, perhaps some would say. But that's one of the reasons why we chose that transition. You also start to see civil rights legislation in our state in 1965. So some real changes happening in state government at that time. And the Place to Grow symbol gets launched again, if you're old enough to remember, which I am. 1970, Governor Ray is trying to promote our state, and so launches the Place to Grow campaign as Iowa is a place for all sorts of development and a way to bring some energy to economic development in our state. So that's part of that optimism as well. And of course, we do talk about the farm crisis. The artifact that I chose to highlight, that's a women's track jacket, and a woman from central Iowa, Jean Robinson, graduated high school in the fall or spring of 1972, excuse me, then enrolls at Iowa State in the fall of 1972. Title IX had just been passed, but was not really taking effect. And Jean was a solid high school track athlete, runner, short and middle distance for the most part, at Baxter High School in central Iowa. When she gets to Iowa State, she decides she wants to run on the women's track team. Well, Iowa State and most universities were not supplying uniforms to their female athletes. And so Jean's mother sewed her top that we have in our mobile museum and shorts that we also have. Jean's mother sewed her track uniform. So the women had to supply their own track uniforms for the Iowa State women's track team in 1972. And Jean donated that to us. She lives in the Iowa City area now, but Jean's sister had the sewing machine that her mom used. So her sister donated the sewing machine to us about a year ago. So we not only have clothing that their mother, Alice, made, but also the sewing machine. And Alice was an accomplished seamstress. So it's a really nicely made Iowa State track uniform that we have from them. And then in the Iowa in the Global World section, talk about really Iowa has been connected to a global world for over 300 years. Back to the 1690s, you could argue, when French contact happens with the native peoples. So from that point forward, you've got international relations playing a role in our state, 1670s, I should say. And so the Iowa Global World is a little bit of a modern construct, but truly becoming more and more connected to a global world. So the main image on the lower section of that panel is African women who had immigrated to Des Moines in the late 1990s and were part of a English language learning class and childcare class. But also we highlight world trade. So there's a section with a delegation visiting then President Xi in China, and it involved Governor Branstad when he was still governor, now Ambassador Branstad, but also wanted to highlight green energy. And so talking about wind power and the changes that's had in our state, especially in western and central and northwest Iowa, and also biofuels with ethanol and biodiesel. And so those are the images that we chose to highlight in talking about the green energy role in our state. And then we have been collecting through the pandemic and into 2020 and 2021 on what's been happening in our state through the more recent past. And so we're able to collect some materials from social justice rally up in Spencer, and it does. I'm so pleased to be talking to you all in Scott County, but do try to pay attention to stories from all across our state. And so the rally that Unite poster is from, done by a white artist, but his friend Ty Jackson, who he had known from his time at Spencer Elementary and Spencer High School, one of the few Black men in Spencer. They were both part of the social justice rally held in Spencer, Iowa. And so Brock Storm is an artist from Spencer living in Everly, a small town in Clay County. And so that was the poster that Brock designed for the social justice rally in Spencer in June of 2020. Connected to the murder of George Floyd. So we've been collecting things both related to the pandemic and related to social justice. As Catherine said, there you get to see Gene Robinson's Iowa State track uniform actually in that interior shot of the mobile museum, our Winnebago RV that travels around with a smaller version of this, and so grateful that Catherine got the pop-up version too. And that mobile museum, we had it at the Putnam Museum when it was our Iowans at Home, Work, and Play exhibit. Look forward to having it back to Scott County, and it'll hit all 99 counties over the next 3 years. So I don't think we've done Scott yet. And so look for it in your area sometime in 2022 or 2023. And then we just finished our last Iowa History Book Club, but it will be coming back next year. And so as people that pay attention to things at the library, look for the Iowa History Book Club, follow us on iowaculture.gov through our website, and check out the Iowa History Book Club, which will be relaunched in 2022. And then we have been offering webinars for the last 2 years on Iowa History 101. We only do one typically in November and December because of the holidays. So recorded one earlier this month on how the film It's a Wonderful Life, celebrating its 75th anniversary of release, shows American history. I hosted it, talked with a friend of mine, Chris Wilson, who's he's the head of experience design for the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian's museum, and he and I are both big fans of that film. And so look at It's a Wonderful Life from a historical perspective. That's been recorded. There's a whole series that are recorded, and we'll relaunch those programs beginning in January 2022. So if you like learning about history, as you must, look for our Iowa History 101 webinar series through the museum. They're on Thursdays at noon. And as I said, they're recorded just like this talk is, and so you can see the archived versions, and would encourage you to check those out. We also, out of Iowa City, do our Iowa Stories series, and so that's another set of online programs. Looking forward, hopefully, to having those be live as well at our Iowa City office, the Centennial Building. But right now, those are also virtual. And just check our calendar out and look for the Iowa Stories programming that we offer. And then finally, we did just publish Annals of Iowa as a special edition on Iowa history. That's our quarterly academic journal, and some really great essays looking at the breadth of Iowa history and topics in Iowa history. So you can subscribe by going to iowaculture.gov and going to the history tab. I'm hoping that the public library is a subscriber to Annals of Iowa, and so if you aren't ready to jump in yet, if not, I would say to Catherine, you should try to get a copy of that for the special collections. And then my colleague Jess Rundlet does some Iowa trivia sessions, so maybe Catherine, you might want to bring Jess in to do a topic sometime for your members or for your patrons. That would be a good one. Jess is with the museum team and knows a lot of Iowa history and uses material from our Iowa Culture app to do an Iowa history trivia session. So with that, not totally sure Catherine and I didn't work this out, but we're a small group, so I don't mind live questions coming in however we want to do it. But I'm willing to stick around for another 10 or 15 minutes, however long Catherine wants to keep this going, to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Leo. It was a real pleasure to hear all the work that you guys have done to promote Iowa history.